First of all, thank you very much for getting me on this panel together with my very good friend Alexander, who is also a comrade and a colleague with whom I cooperated and well, worked in contact for so many years. But of course, you see, speaking to Russians or making Russians speak about Russian Revolution of 1917 these days is something which very often and very easily can make us unhappy because the current situation of Russian society and the current decline of Russian politics and even in some ways Russian culture, not to mention social practice, is to some extent depressing. And well, we can start with the good news or the bad news. And the good news is that no matter what happens, characters associated with the Russian Revolution still remain quite essential for Russian public. So in that sense, the society which we have in Russia still is continuing the historic legacy and the historic continuity, the historic development which was started with and by the Russian Revolution. And in that sense, we still are in the process which is very much characterized by the continuity of events which were provoked by what happened in Petrograd in 1917. By the way, recently, it was just about a few days ago, there was a survey done by Levada Sociological Center, which is one of the most prominent polling centers in Russia. Although, of course, I should say we have to be very careful about Russian sociology because often people do not say what they really think, and the questions asked by the pollsters are very often very inadequate. But still, this survey gave us a very interesting result that, for example, Lenin is by far more popular than Putin in today's Russia. And this is the good news. Again, for the bad news, Stalin is by far more popular than anybody in Russia these days. And this is not necessarily something which can be attributed to his role in the revolution or to his role as the dictator who nevertheless carried out and continued the revolutionary tradition. Because also the real trick and the real secret of Stalin's popularity with Russians is that he is very often approved by people with absolutely different and sometimes totally different points of view. So in that sense, current regime of Vladimir Putin very often also refers to Stalin as a representative of a strong hand which controlled the society, didn't allow any freedoms or any deviations to happen. And in that sense, Stalin is very often praised by Russian government and its propaganda, at the same time put into the context which is profoundly anti-communist. So in that sense, he's not represented as the person and the leader who continued the revolutionary impulse, like Bonaparte of Russian Revolution, if you want, but rather as yet another Tsar, like all other Tsars, and the more conservative interpretation of Stalinism you get this way, the better. In that sense, ironically, Russian official propaganda very often follows a Trotskyist, Thermidorian interpretation of Russian Revolution, saying, well, Stalin betrayed the revolution, and that was good about Stalin. That's why we love Stalin from the point of view of Russian elite. And at the same time, yes, you can have people who are nostalgic for the Soviet Union, who also can have very distinctive, different views, and sometimes opposite views. It's very important. It's just, as I told you, people with opposite views very often praise Stalin. And then you can see people who are nostalgic traditional communists or whatever sort or whatever kind of tendency. So in that sense, the popularity of Stalin doesn't explain much, except that it explains two things. It explains that first, you still remember characters associated with the Russian Revolution, and they're still important, much more important than current politicians for Russian imagination. And second, that no matter of what political color is the respondent, these characters remain within kind of public thought, within public discourse. Then let's look through these years in a more historic way. And then we can come to some very interesting conclusions, because, and not necessarily very optimistic conclusions, because on the one hand, if we see Russian Revolution as an attempt to build socialism, then we end up with a pessimistic conclusion that so far it didn't work out. So remembering the same Stalin, who said that socialism won completely and irreversibly, well, both ways it went wrong. The victory of the revolutionary new system was reversed, and definitely it was never complete. Honestly, I don't think that Soviet Union became a socialist society, though in many ways it was trying to move towards a socialist society, and in many ways it was acquiring certain characteristics which I think should be attributed to a socialist society. But as a whole, Soviet society remained quite contradictory and quite uneven in its social and political and democratic development. And though in a certain sense, we could see some very important social progress which was made throughout the Soviet period, I think Stalin was basically completely wrong, saying that Soviet Union achieved socialism in the 1930s. Of course, it did not. And at the same time, if we are looking at the progress which was made by the Soviet society, not just Russian society, but also by the societies of different Soviet republics throughout these 70 plus years, we can see tremendous breakthrough, tremendous change, and just don't forget that country was not fully industrialized. It had enormous numbers, enormous percentage of illiterate population. The level of urbanization and general modernization was very low. So you can present Soviet experience as an experience of a successful modernization. And then I think this is also a very interesting point to make comparison with China. I think our Chinese colleagues would pick it up and probably develop. Of course, here you can see the same problem, which I think is also important for the Chinese experience. So in that sense, we can have a very serious doubt whether this society really achieved socialism. And it's more than doubt. I think there is no doubt it didn't achieve socialism. But at the same time, was this kind of progress acquirable, possible, without a revolution. And was this progress, would it be possible without a revolutionary breaking with the logic of capitalist bourgeois development at some point? I think the answer is no. In that sense, the kind of social change which happened in Russia in the 1920s and 1930s, which actually removed bourgeoisie from the society and replaced the logic of capitalist market with the logic of planned development and with the logic, let it be the bureaucratic centralized planning, to be exactly honest. Nevertheless, was absolutely essential as a crucial stage for that society to speed up the movement and overcome its backwardness and overcome its peripheral status, peripheral condition within capitalist world system. I think in that sense, comparison with China is quite meaningful because, okay, now kind of everybody praises China. Well, communists praise China because it has a communist party ruling the country. Well, liberals praise China for its market reforms. Even Russian nationalists praise China because it seems to be in conflict with the West. And as we know, Russian nationalism presupposes that everybody who is against the West, no matter why, these are good guys, and because the West represents evil. So in that sense, it's very easy to praise China these days. But again, well, I'm not going to discuss how successful is China's development these days exactly. But again, let's put it differently. Was this kind of development, was this kind of success, would it be possible without the Maoist revolution? And again, my guess, I hope you will agree with me, maybe we will not, but my answer is no. Without the Maoist revolution, which itself was in many ways influenced by Russian Revolution, these successes of today's China, even with its kind of more and more pro-market and more pro-capitalist orientation, wouldn't have been possible. Then coming back to Russia, now let's come back to the bad news. The bad news is that quite a lot of what was acquired throughout the 20th century was lost or destroyed during the last 30 years. So during these last 30 years, Russian neoliberal reforms, unlike Chinese reforms, by the way, systematically undermined quite a lot of achievements, including cultural achievements of Soviet Russia. There was massive deindustrialization. Russian science was systematically decapitated, and not only it was disinvested, but also there was a systematic pressure on Russian scientists to leave the country because the current system, the current elite thinks that too many intellectuals is really very bad for the country. And even intellectuals who are not scholars, but scientists in natural sciences, these people are also potentially very dangerous, so it's better not to have them here. Well, the logic of Russian economic development, of course, I hope that Alexander would be more detailed on that, of course, is very consistent because Russian elites put their stakes with turning this country into an exporter of raw materials and energy, oil and gas in particular. And in that sense, the more you export, the better. In that sense, having national industry and even science, which is connected to industrial development, is a burden. So it's a liability. So the less developed is the country, the better from this point of view. This is very logical because, well, domestic consumption especially domestic consumption by industry, competes with export. So, of course, I'm not speaking about consumers on their as individuals, because of course the consumer society is making progress. These developments, which were definitely and deeply reactionary, could be to some extent morally compensated from the point of view of the elite and from the point of view of liberal intellectuals by the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia became more democratic. And in many ways it was true, because Russia did become more democratic, more free. It is even now, even with all this Putin's autocracy and all these repressions which people are facing right now in this country, Russia is in many ways is still a kind of free country, because the general principle is you are free as long as you do not mix up with politics. So if you're not involved in any kind of political activities, whatever you do is okay, including certain practices which are completely illegal elsewhere. So in that sense, Russia did become a sort of a kind of free country, and this is really true. But even from the point of view of political democracy, in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw considerable political democratization, real freedom of press, real freedom of debate, though of course television and mass media, the real big mass media, remained very much under elitist control, but this is no news for anyone who knows the West as well. But I mean, technically, you were allowed to say or even to publish whatever you wanted, even though nobody would read it, by the way, but at least you were not going to be arrested for that. So in that sense, yes, we have this progress of freedom, which is also reversed. It is also reversed, and it is gradually reversed throughout the period of Putin's domination, Putin's rule. Actually, to be honest, it started getting reversed much earlier, because don't forget the coup d'etat of 1993, which was organized by Boris Yeltsin. So it's when now Western media and some Russian liberals just blame Putin for everything, they're wrong, because he just continued the trajectory which was started already by Yeltsin. But clearly that accelerated throughout Putin's period, and especially accelerated in the last 2 years. So the level of repression is increasing. Electoral practices are completely distorted, and we're getting close to the next election, which is due to take place in September. This time, electoral law is changed in such a way that winning seats for opposition politicians technically becomes impossible unless the government itself kind of grants them this or that seat. So in that sense, the electoral democracy is completely destroyed. But again, if you see Western media, or we see Russian liberal circles, or some, even ironically, even some leftist intellectuals, they all attribute that to Putin's biography, being a former KGB functionary or whatever, being an authoritarian personality, and so on, which is total nonsense. The real logic is that logic of social degeneration, because when you get the society which is getting weaker and weaker, economy is getting structurally increasingly weak, and contradictions, social contradictions, class contradictions are increasing massively and very rapidly. And at the same time, we see a rapid development of the consumer society. So consumerism is definitely on the rise, but at the same time, the real capacity to people to satisfy their own consumer demands and desires is decreasing, just because they don't have money, and the money is distributed in a very disproportionate way. In that sense, social inequality in Russia is really pathetic, much more than in Central Europe, not to speak about Western Europe, and well, even worse than in the United States. So it's very much getting closer to the third world, to the countries of the third world. And of course, given all these contradictions, given the fact that there is a growing structural crisis within Russian economy, also given the fact that institutionally, the society is structured in such a way that Russian politics is very much about preserving this inequality and preventing any kind of challenges to it. It's no surprise that the political system is getting less and less democratic. Democracy is a challenge, and it's a real danger, a threat for this kind of system. So in that sense, of course, it's much more than Putin, and in a certain sense, Putin just represents or this tendency, or presides over this tendency rather than really dominates it and really is central for it. Finally, what are we facing now given this situation? Well, ironically, more than 100 years after Russian Revolution, Russia needs a new revolution much more than ever. So in that sense, one of the reasons why revolution is becoming a real kind of danger again, why is it kind of haunting the current elites? It's just because, well, objective contradictions are leading into the very same direction. And in many ways, Russian elite now repeats the same mistakes or same behavior, which was typical for their for the Tsarist regime. They think that maybe repression is going to be enough to prevent revolutionary changes. Technically, it may work, but it's not going to work in the long run socially. So in that sense, the legacy of Russian Revolution remains quite alive, just because we need another one. And it's very hard to imagine this kind of society to be transformed with purely reformist or revolutionary policies. Though at the same time, we don't see any kind of revolutionary force in making, but I don't think this is so important because, when certain social development is becoming real, it produces its own heroes. The only point is that we have to understand that it's not going to happen automatically. It needs to be worked on. And then let's look again on this history from the point of view of some kind of historical philosophy or historical logic. And well, when Trotsky used the term Thermidorian regime, when he tried to characterize a Soviet regime in the late 1920s, I think the most important thing was not whether he was exactly right or wrong in his analysis of what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. I think he, in many ways, was wrong, by the way, and he himself had, in the 1930s, to correct much of his analysis. But the important thing is that he kind of tried to see the logic of a revolutionary process, which can be attributed to different revolutions. So in that sense, the French model, if we see that as a kind of ideal model of a revolutionary process, can be attributed both to English Revolution and to Russian Revolution, and I don't know whether it could be attributed to Chinese Revolution, because so far it didn't work this way. But at least European revolutions seem to follow this logic. And the logic is that first you have the initial stage, which is very much that of democratic movements and democratic changes, which nevertheless cannot be stabilized because of the social change which is also happening simultaneously, never necessarily facing tremendous resistance from the old ruling classes. So you end up with a revolutionary dictatorship, and this revolutionary dictatorship, which was used to be Jacobin dictatorship in France, so Bolshevik dictatorship in Russia, ends up in some sort of Thermidorian degeneration, Thermidorian decline, or self-denial at some point, and then gets consolidated by a Bonapartist regime, which on the one hand strangles the revolutionary initiative, the revolutionary impulse, and at the same time is consolidating some of the most important technical and social achievements of the revolution. So what we've got with post-Stalin Soviet Union was the continuation of this Bonapartist phase. And unlike Napoleon Bonaparte, who was finally defeated militarily by the forces of the old Europe, Soviet Union succeeded for a very long time because Soviet Union won the Second World War. And in that sense, Russian Bonapartist phase was very long and very stable. But then still, next phase happened anyhow. It was restoration. And of course, they didn't restore monarchy so far, but they restored a regime of a monarchist type, and more they restored capitalism. They restored the market, they restored all these institutions of Russian ancien regime, including some very pathetic ones like Cossacks and so on, and even they're trying to create this kind of new aristocracy and so on. And the heraldic symbols of Russian republic seem to be very monarchist and so on. But it's not about monarchy, it's about capitalism first and foremost. Well, we are in this stage, and just because Bonaparte's stage was so long, so much prolonged and so in many ways successful, that we end up with a restoration being also extremely deep and destructive. Well, the question is whether we are going to face our own glorious revolution. Historically, I think this is inevitable. How it will happen, I don't know. What I know is that we have to work on it. Thank you.